Okay, it's 15 past, so I think we can get started. So this session is about the Drupal Core markup and continuous upgrade paths. And thank you for coming to my session. So let me double check that the slides are working. Yeah, seems to be all good. So yeah, my name is Lauri Escola, and on Drupal.org, you can see me using the nickname Lauri with 3 I's. I'm a senior software engineer based in Helsinki and working for Acquia in the Drupal acceleration team. And if you are wondering about why am I interested about the Drupal core markup and continuous upgrade paths, the reason for that is that I'm a Drupal front-end framework manager and a team system maintainer. So I do review a lot of patches sort of related to the front end. So as you might have experienced, upgrading Drupal themes has been a bit challenging in the past. So for example, upgrading Drupal 7 theme to Drupal 8 required almost a complete rewrite. And even looking at the Drupal 6 to Drupal 7 upgrade instructions, those instructions simply just recommended installing and setting Garland as the default theme. After reinstalling your custom theme, most things would probably work, but there would be always some things that would be broken. What is actually broken. And at least for me, I never had sufficient regression testing for the front-end code, so that didn't really help the problem. So after the time-consuming upgrade from Drupal 7 to Drupal 8, the maintainers of Drupal Core and kind of the whole community have decided that we should prioritize making upgrades much more easier. And for that reason, the community and the core team have spent a lot of time and energy during the Drupal 8 to Drupal 9 lifecycle to ensure that the upgrades would be as smooth as possible. So I don't know how many of you have already upgraded to Drupal 9, but I hope that you agree that upgrading from Drupal 8 to Drupal 9 was easy. I don't know, maybe you can write in the chat if you figured out that upgrading from Drupal 8 to Drupal 9 was easy. And you can say something if you haven't upgraded Drupal 9 yet. Well, doesn't seem like okay. 8 to 9 was easy. Some comments, and some people haven't still upgraded. Well, I hope that when you do upgrade to Drupal 9, that you find it easy, because we did spend a lot of energy on that. And so the reason why upgrades from Drupal 8 onwards are easy is that Drupal is implementing something called continuous upgrade path. And well, first of all, that means that there's no going back to the days of Drupal 8 development cycle where we could, for example, markup, we could change pretty relentlessly. And I guess it was nice at the time, but now we are prioritizing these easier upgrades, which I think definitely makes sense. And so the continuous upgrade path essentially means that we are deprecating the old behavior. And when we deprecate something, we are adding some documentation, which allows IDEs, for example, to detect that that piece of code is deprecated. And we also add some logic to the code that should trigger a warning, so that if you are calling code on your site that is deprecated, you should get a warning on your site. There's also dedicated tooling for finding usages of deprecated code, such as upgrade status module. And that's also great because it gives developers time to adjust their code before the old behavior gets completely removed in the next major release. So let's see how is the readiness of each of the components affecting Drupal frontend right now. So here, I've kind of tried to collect most of the pieces that are in the Drupal frontend and could be impacted by the continuous upgrade paths. So I'm going to start by themes itself. This is kind of specific to Drupal core. So we do have a process for deprecating themes. Right now it's just a proof of concept, but we are working on probably introducing a new key that would allow marking themes as deprecated and make it really easy, but not necessarily very useful for the contrib or custom projects, because if they don't necessarily have to mark teams deprecated ever. So I'm not going to go deeper into that. Something that we also had to figure out during the Drupal 9 lifecycle was that how can we deprecate YAML configuration keys? Essentially, that's different type of metadata that teams and other extensions have to provide for the team and extension to work. So, for example, libraries or some kind of data in the info.yaml file. So, for example, during the Drupal 9 lifecycle, we changed the behavior of the base team property in the info YAML so that we made it required. So we deprecated having it not set. So if you haven't set base team, you would get a warning on your site, and we would call and ask you to add a value for that property. Not going to go deeper into that. That's also, I would say, more specific to core internals. Then we have regions, and the good thing about the regions is that they're not inherited to subteams. They are not therefore accessible by subteams, so we don't necessarily need to have to deprecate those. Library overrides is kind of another aspect of something that is set in the info.yaml, and we don't have a way to deprecate those right now. I'm going to talk about the kind of things that are missing more in more detail after I've kind of walked through all of the different bits to kind of get a sense where we are first. So on the second group, I have like data processing, and we do have a process for deprecating hooks that's pre-existing from modules, nothing specific to the teams, so not really going to talk about that as well. We have preprocess functions, which is basically one of the APIs that is handling arrays, and for the array type of APIs, we don't really have a process for introducing deprecations right now. Then we have team suggestions, and we don't really have a way to mark team suggestions as deprecated right now. And it's probably something that you might need if you want to remove a team suggestion from the list of team suggestions that a team in core or team or module provides in Drupal core. Then we have render elements, info alter, and pre-render and process functions. So I would say the render elements probably go to the group of array type of APIs, and then we have the pre-render and process functions that are kind of following the normal deprecation process for functions. So that's something that is possible to do right now. Then deprecating templates doesn't exist yet. So for example, if we wanted to remove a template from Drupal core, we would have to first deprecate it, and we don't have a process for that right now. Then inside the templates, we have variables, and process for deprecating template variables doesn't exist yet. We have HTML elements that you can use inside templates. We don't have process for deprecating those. Now, that doesn't necessarily make that much sense because of HTML is not a programming language, so it's not necessarily going to be possible to introduce deprecations there, but just for the sake of marking it here, saying that we don't have a process for that. We don't really have a process for making changes other than like just deprecating a whole theme. Then we have trick blocks and macros, which could be surprising for some people that we have here. And the reason for having them here is that if you use a trick block or macro in your template, is that you are essentially providing API for other templates because they can load your template and use that block or macro in the other template. So especially in core, if there's a block and we want to remove that, we would have to deprecate the old block first. Also something that we haven't figured out a process for yet, something that is to be done. During the Drupal 9 lifecycle, we figured out a process for deprecating libraries, which is great. So for example, during the Drupal 9 lifecycle, we deprecated lots of jQuery UI libraries. And here's an example of jQuery cookie, which is currently marked as deprecated in Drupal 9 and to be removed in Drupal 10. So basically, you just have to provide a deprecated key on part of the library definition in the libraries.yaml file. There's an issue on the bottom if you're interested to see how this was done. Then we have individual CSS files or maybe pieces of like individual CSS selectors or rules. We don't have process for deprecating those. Again, probably doesn't make that much sense, but for the sake of just tracking down what can be quite easy for us to change and what is not, marking it here is something that we don't have. And then we have JavaScript, where we do have process for deprecating functions and properties. So for example, here's jQuery cookie, which we replaced with JS cookie. And so this is something that we introduced in Drupal 9.2, so that JS cookie will be the default option in Drupal 10, and we have kind of this wrapper around JS cookie to keep the existing usages of jQuery cookie working. And if you're using jQuery cookie, then we would give you this warning. And since we've also added this piece of documentation to the doc block, your IDE would be able to recognize that this function is deprecated. So we're still missing a way to turn the deprecation warnings on in browsers, and also we're missing tooling in the upgrade status module for detecting these. So if you are interested in working two of these parts, there's issues on the bottom of the slide. So someone asked on the Slack, on the chat, if it would be possible to share the slides. I will share the slides after the presentation. So I will tweet them out on my Twitter account, which is Lauri with 2 I's and then number 1 in the end. And I will also add them to the event session node. So then you can find all of the links and information from there. So here's an overview of how ready we are on the front end for the continuous upgrade path. So as you can see, we are still missing quite a few parts, if you will, on the front end. So let's filter out the bits that we've already covered, and let's focus on the parts that are missing. So here's all of the APIs that are still missing a deprecation process. So what I think would make sense is grouping these into 3 different groups. So we have APIs that need a defined process. So these are basically similar type of APIs that we've already added deprecation processes for earlier on the PHP side of things. Then we have the next group that we have is no-code syntaxes. So we have HTML and CSS. So this is kind of its own tricky group because of it doesn't necessarily make that much sense to introduce deprecation processes there, or you would have to use something else at least, like JavaScript, to introduce deprecation process there. And then the final group is array type of APIs. So that's preprocess functions, form alters, and render element info alters. And I think this is kind of a unified group where we need to figure out solutions for how to deprecate array type of APIs. So yeah, I think the first group that I'm going to talk about is going to be the APIs that need a defined process. So I'm going to start by talking about the Twig macros and blocks. And a great thing related to this is that Twig 2.6 has a built-in function for triggering deprecation warnings, which I think we would be able to utilize in Drupal Core. Unfortunately, we don't have a documented process for using it yet, but that should be pretty easy because the function exists already. We just need to kind of make sure that all of our tooling can detect the usage of this function, and that we have kind of documented format for the messages that exist. So here's again, there's a link on the bottom of the slide for the documentation page, and there's also a link for the issue for documenting how to deprecate the Twig macros and blocks. The second type of API where we have to add new processes for adding deprecations is template variables and theme suggestions. And so I think similar approach could be taken to both of these use cases. So it's I think these APIs, what they could benefit from is approach where we could wrap the variable or the output that we're giving with a object that is essentially allowing someone who is accessing that variable to get the data But whenever they are accessing the data, we would also throw a warning to let them know that they are using a deprecated variable. So for example, here I have a code that is deprecating a variable from a template. So for example, in this example, we have renamed the doc name variable into just name. So we are initializing we're creating a new deprecated object here, and we're telling first what is a new variable that people should use, and then we have a message explaining the same. And like I said, probably similar approach could be taken into team suggestions. There's 2 issue links again on the bottom of the slide if you are interested to work on this, but I think something like this could be implemented on that issue pretty easily. The next step is you have to be able to deprecate templates, and the Twig deprecate function or tag that is built in to Twig from earlier slide could theoretically be used for this, but the difference to what we probably need and what that provides is that is going to deprecate a specific instance of a template rather than the kind of whole team hook or like all of the different instances of the template, like overrides, preprocess functions, and team suggestions, and so on. So what is that is probably what we actually need in Drupal Core. So what we probably have to provide is instead a new key in the hook theme so that we can mark a template as a deprecated, and that would then trigger a deprecation warning whenever someone is overriding a template or using that template anywhere. Then the final piece related to the I would say more generic type of APIs is library overrides and extends. And the reason why we have to be concerned about the library overrides and extends is that they decide which CSS files and JavaScript files are going to be loaded on the page. And those are inherited subthemes, essentially. And so, for example, if you replace the jQuery UI dialog with a Bootstrap dialog, that obviously has an impact on your child themes. There could be some more subtle changes that could have an impact on the child theme, but essentially we can just sum up that the library overrides and extends are something that have an impact on the child themes and something that we have to be concerned about. There's also some issues about kind of same asset being overridden by multiple different teams. So for example, because you are using the asset name or the path as the key of that file, if it has been already overridden, the path can change. So once those paths are changing, it can be a bit tricky to know which one to use for the override, but also it can be breaking backwards compatibility if you provide a new override because of your child theme could be already overriding it, and then they would have to be aware that you are introducing a new override. I'm not sure if we have a solution for this yet. A potential solution would be to kind of limit the usage of this in base teams, at least. But this is probably something we have to explore a bit more. So I'm going to mark the theme suggestion, Twig blocks, macros, variables, and templates as something that we sort of have figured out a plan how to mitigate those, how to address those problems. But library overrides, I have to say that we probably don't have a good plan, at least yet. Then moving forward to the no-code syntaxes. So as I said earlier, since these are not actual programming languages, implementing a deprecation process would be difficult, if it would be even possible. And the current approach that we've taken is that we avoid disruptive changes. And whenever we have to ship disruptive changes, we've basically just shipped a completely new theme. And that's what we did with Stable 9. So we wanted to ship a new set of markup as part of Drupal 9. So instead of Stable 8, Drupal 9 ships with Stable 9, which has updated markup. We don't have a good way to upgrade to Stable 9. I don't necessarily recommend upgrading to Stable 9 because of it can be tedious. Like, for example, we upgraded the Drupal core teams to stable 9, and it took us weeks, if not months, to do the upgrade. So I would recommend probably continuing to use the stable 8, and as I think it will be supported in the future. Any new teams you probably should build with stable 9. So let's look at what we consider as a backwards compatibility breaking markup and CSS change in Drupal. So on this slide, what you can see is on the left side is a template that we have in Classy. So that's our base theme. On the middle, there's some CSS that is in Classy. And on the right side of the screen, you can see output that we expect that this has on the browser. So what kind of a change to the CSS that is in Classy? So actually, before that, I'm going to introduce this. So we have the overriding template, which is switching the span element into div. And we still have the same CSS loading in Classy. And now the next step is for us to figure out what kind of changes to the CSS that is in Classy could lead into this rendering in an unexpected way. Like what would essentially break because of the subtheme has changed the span into a div. Anyone have any guesses on what type of a change could break in this scenario? So I'm going to show an example of that. So what if we switched the selector from using just the element class into using a element class that is type of span element. And Benji on the chat said that if Classy changes the name of the CSS class, that's definitely also going to break. And that's something that we don't allow people to do. But there's also some like kind of more subtle things that could be breaking it. Like, for example, here, because of the subtheme has changed the span element into a div, it doesn't have a display inline anymore. It's a display block because that's the default value for divs. And we kind of want to highlight this piece of text using a yellow background color. And with a div, because it's block, it's going to work differently than we expect it to work based on the markup that we had in Classy. I think there's numerous different ways that you could make this break, but these are just like two different ways that I could imagine that this would be breaking. So here's just another example of this. Instead of overriding the template, I'm going to just override the CSS. So on my subtheme, what I'm going to do is I'm going to extend the CSS of Classy. And what I'm doing here is I'm now adding the background color here. So you can see this is basically what we expected to have in core on the previous slide. And now I'm wondering if you have any guesses on how we could, any more guesses how we could break this now that we've added this piece of CSS in the subtheme. We had some good guesses on the previous one. Let's see if we have any guesses this time. So Jess on the Slack is suggesting that we change the markup of the template. That's a pretty, I guess, generic request, but yeah, I think there's almost any change in the template would break this. But so the first change that I'm going to introduce, which is an interesting one. So I'm going to change the color from hot pink into yellow. And this would work by itself pretty well if the subtheme didn't change the background color into yellow. But because the Classy is not aware that the subtheme has changed the background color into yellow, now you can't see the text anymore. And second example is, I think, pretty close to what Jess was suggesting. We are changing the CSS class into something else. This is something that we pretty commonly want to do in Drupal Core. So we want to change the classes into something else because we are doing some refactoring or cleanup. And so we are updating the CSS of Drupal Core, but we can't update the child theme's CSS. So it's not going to apply anymore to this. And we could obviously keep the element class in place for the element. But the problem that we have is that essentially we would have to have a process for removing those eventually, because otherwise we have just like infinite number of classes on all of the elements. So while that could work in the for a while, in the long run, that would not work that well. Well, the conclusion of all of this is that predicting the outcome of markup and CSS changes in Drupal can be quite hard. And most template and markup changes could be considered in one way or another as a backwards compatibility breaking change. And that also means that most markup or CSS changes could be disruptive, at least right now. And for that reason also, we've basically tried avoiding making any type of changes as much as we can. This has been good for stability, but it has also prevented us from making any kind of progress on kind of trying to modernize the markup or providing better sensible defaults to people. The root cause for this problem, because of you might have not heard of it outside of Drupal, is what I believe is the override variations. So we have a variation where template is overridden without overriding the respective CSS files. And this is risky because of the CSS changes in the base theme are not necessarily going to be compatible with the template override. The second variation is that CSS files are overridden or extended without overriding the respective templates. And this is also risky because of if core then changes the template in future, they're not necessarily going to be compatible with your CSS overrides in the sub-theme. And the third and final variation, which is both template and CSS files have been overridden, is the safe variation, because of do you have ownership of both CSS and templates, any changes to the base theme are not going to affect your sub-theme. So this raises a question, like, could we prevent partial overrides in Drupal core or in any kind of Drupal theme and Drupal modules? What if we bundle CSS and templates together? So this has sparked an idea of creating a new starter kit theme. So right now, we use classy as a starting point for people who want sort of reasonable defaults rather than a blank canvas when they start building a theme. And instead of serving this from a base theme, with the starter kit idea, the idea is that we would provide a command that front-end developers could use to generate a theme with these templates and CSS. And as a result, the markup rendered on the site would be the same as it was before when they used classy. And the good thing about that is that even if we change the defaults, it would remain the same between releases because they already have the ownership of the whole markup. And with this change, we would be able to make markup changes much more easily because we wouldn't have to worry about consequences on production sites. What I do think this would also help us with is that it would make it easier for new developers to discover how CSS files are loaded, where is the markup located in different templates, because of all of the markup and CSS would be located in a single extension, single theme, single folder directory. Unfortunately, this doesn't come without some downsides. And basically, we should ensure that this doesn't increase the maintenance burden of site owners, at least too much, because this could impact how easy it is for us to ship fixes for security vulnerabilities, because of more of the templates will be overridden as we kind of recommend all of the front-end developers to override all of our templates as their starting point. This is sort of a pre-existing problem because we already can't really rely on the fact that template doesn't get overridden. Because of templates can be already overridden. And so, for example, if we have a security vulnerability on the node template, I would assume that most templates are overriding that one. And on the positive note, I would say when it comes to the security vulnerabilities, we didn't ship a single security release changing templates or CSS during the Drupal 8 lifecycle. This doesn't necessarily mean we wouldn't have to ship one in future, but definitely is hinting that it might not be as big of a problem as it might sound like first. Another big drawback of this approach is that it can only solve this problem in the scope of core. We can't really include all of the templates from Contrib in this one theme in Drupal core. or whatever. Maybe it's not a team. It's kind of a directory that contains the defaults. Anyway, I don't think it's reasonable to assume that we would be able to have all of the markup and CSS from contrib on that directory. And something that's also important to note is that so we had this plan consensus banana back in the day in DrupalCon Austin, and because we didn't plan it in a way that would take contrib into account, they haven't been able to implement that plan, even though it was decided on years ago. And so basically the plan on the consensus banana was that we decided that Drupal core markup should be as plain as possible, and all of the classes, design elements, etc., would be moved to classy. So that was done core first, not necessarily something that contrib would be able to implement. And that's basically StarterKit it's suffering from the same problem, that it doesn't necessarily solve this to the scope of contrib. And sort of against to the consensus banana is that toolbar, quick edit, and contextual links have all of their design shipped as part of the core modules, so they are not really implementing that either yet. And that's not something we can necessarily solve with StarterKit, because we don't necessarily want the StarterKit to override toolbar, quick edit, and contextual links, because those are probably parts that we want to keep updating in future. And so yeah, let's talk about the remaining problems with the StarterKit idea. So the first problem that we realized was that how can we reduce the maintenance burden of site owners? Because if we essentially add some of that, is there anything we could do to reduce that? So something that we can do is that if there's critical security updates, since Twig templates are compiled and we have control over, is that if we see certain type of source code in Twig, we could theoretically at least add something to our compilation phase that would mitigate those vulnerabilities in their Twig source code. And this is probably something we should already be doing if we have any vulnerabilities that are impacting Twig templates. So it's not necessarily something new that we need to figure out because of the StarterKit. It's just that it's highlighting a problem that we have to be really considerate about sites and teams overriding templates. For less critical issues, we could potentially provide change records or even patches for like individual templates that people could apply on their teams. If they are impacted by a bug that is really annoying, they could then apply that patch on their team to the template, if that's something that they want to do. Especially I feel like the mitigation of the process for mitigating the security vulnerabilities, I feel like it addresses a big part of that concern. Then the second concern that I think we should consider is how should contrib ship their markup without breaking BC. I think it's really important to keep the contrib as part of the plan, so that they have a way to kind of follow a similar kind of pattern as core doing, so that we can keep the kind of whole ecosystem following the same pattern. So as I said earlier, I believe that the root cause to the problem is the kind of mixed ownership of templates and CSS, the shared ownership of those. So what I think we should do to address is that we load CSS and non-functional JavaScript in templates. And what that would end up doing is that once you are overriding a template or CSS, you would have to take ownership of all of those different parts related at the same time. And this does also have an impact on the kind of maintainability and like teams having to override all of the templates, because if they choose not to use the StarterKit theme, they would still benefit from this approach because of we've now bundled the CSS and JavaScript and markup together. They could only override the parts that they want. And they would still be able to have BC for that piece of markup and CSS. This could also work for contrib because they could implement the same approach. So they could essentially bundle their CSS and markup together. And if someone wants to override a template or CSS in the contrib project, they could they would have to take ownership of both of those at once. This could also reduce use cases for using the libraries override and extend, which was a problem earlier that we didn't find a solution to. So this would have a lot of positive side effects, I think. Here's just an example of how that could look like. So here I'm using something called twig front matter, and which is a syntax that allows placing contextual information related to the template on top of the template file. And this is used by other projects such as Jekyll. And in Drupal Core, this is already used by Help Topics, which is an experimental module. And yeah, I believe that could be used for loading CSS and JavaScript files too. And this way you can imagine that if you wanted to override that CSS file, you would have to override this template. If you wanted to override this markup, you would have to override those CSS files too. So yeah, I believe that could be a solution for the second drawback of the starter kit approach that we had. So implementing those two things at once. And the third problem that we have is how should we ship the designs for the admin components on the front end? And so if you are unaware of what the admin components on the front end are, that could include contextual links, widget, toolbar, settings tray, and media library, for example. And here's an assumption that I have about the admin components. This is that Drupal core or contrib module should have the ownership of the designs of contextual links, quick edit, toolbar, settings tray, and media library. Because when I start a new front-end team, I don't want to style these modules myself. Also, I want to receive updates on the designs and the functionality of these modules as time passes, since as a site owner, I don't feel ownership over the designs or the functionality of these modules. So this is just to highlight that, for example, toolbar, when I create a new team for Drupal, I don't expect that I have to style and create functionality for toolbar. I expect Drupal core to handle that. And maybe there's some example, maybe you have a site where you want media library to look like your site, but I would say that's an edge case, definitely not the 80% use case. So since a lot of those components are based on the admin team style guide, like for example, quick edit, contextual links, they are based on the 7 style guide right now, and in the future they are going to be based on the Claro style guide. The question is, could we load some of the CSS and markup from the admin team so that we don't have to place it in the starter kit? So first of all, we have to figure out how can we load both styles and markup from the admin team, because of loading to CSS is not going to be enough. Because otherwise, for example, settings tray, which is rendering lots of different kinds of elements inside it, for example, form elements, you could run into a situation where your front-end team wants to have a kind of bespoke markup for your input elements. You have customized the markup to work in your use case. And when they are rendered in settings tray, the settings tray styles are coming from the admin team, and they are incompatible with the changes that you've made. So the markup should be coming from the same place where the CSS is coming from, so that you don't accidentally override components or elements that you don't want to override. And this is already a problem that we have. This is a pre-existing problem that we have, but also something that the starter kit probably should take into account, because it's a pretty big change to how the themes work. Even if we load both CSS and markup from the admin team, it could potentially introduce problems with like CSS namespace, because of CSS is applied globally. And so maybe we have to figure out how we could utilize something like Shadow DOM for these elements. There's an issue link on the bottom of the slide again. If you're interested in Shadow DOM and this whole problem space, feel free to chime in on the issue and help us out. But I feel like if we can figure out these things, and implement these plans, we sort of have solved all of these problems. We have at least a plan in place for addressing all of these concerns. The final part is array type of APIs, which is kind of its own thing. So some of the APIs that we are currently using arrays as an API, we are planning on converting to objects. And that's obviously busy breaking, but something that we've figured out that PHP has is array access, which essentially allows using the array syntax for accessing data in that object. And so on this code example, for example, this is what the issue on the bottom of the page bottom of the slide tries to do is it introduces a new theme hook class, which uses array access. And if you're accessing the theme hooks using the array syntax, like the test on this image is doing, it should continue to work because of we've already implemented kind of the array access path for that. And it is mostly backwards compatible, but not 100% because there are some use cases where you would have to, for example, cast this type of object into an array before it would work the way you expect. There's some APIs that we haven't really planned on converting into objects yet, where we probably have to figure out a way to deprecate individual array items. And here's an example of structural change to render array. And again, how many ways can you think the form could be changed to break this? I think there's quite a few ways we can all imagine that this could be broken. And so I've provided one way that this could be broken. So here I'm moving that description element into a wrapper. So now it's in a completely new location. So you should be accessing it inside the sum wrapper, not directly using description. Interestingly, you're probably not going to get any kind of error, not going to get any kind of hint that something is broken when this change happens. So can be difficult to notice because of essentially what you're just doing is adding a new class to the element. And yeah. Jess is pointing out on the chat that we are making this kind of changes a lot in minor releases. Yeah. So Laravel posted an idea on this issue on the bottom of the slide, which could be really interesting, which would essentially allow us to create portals for when we move elements inside render arrays. And again, we basically give the object the location of the new location of that render array. And if you try to access the old array, it would give you just what is inside there. And when you are accessing it, it would also show you a useful warning telling you that you are accessing it using the wrong directory. So yeah, feel free to chime in on the issue if you're interested. And this does solve some of those problems that I mentioned, but there's I would say more difficult types of changes than just moving the render array in the new location. Like, for example, if you change the render element that we are using. So here on this example, I'm changing the inline template into HTML tag. And again, you're probably not going to get any kind of error, any kind of warning on your site of this. And it's still going to break your site. At least it's going to not work or behave the way that you expected when you built this alter. So something that is, so one of the most common reasons or use cases for changing the render element or template is when we deprecate a template or render element and want to replace it with something else. And one way to tackle this is to pass new variable to the template and render that if the template is not overridden. This way, if the template is overridden, the override would continue to work. We, of course, run into some problems with this because of someone could be just making changes to this using preprocess function, or they could be overriding your CSS without overriding the template. And this would essentially still break their site. But at least some use cases we could continue keeping to function. So if we can implement all of these plans that we have, I think we have a pretty solid plan for supporting these APIs in the continuous upgrade path, being able to make changes and without causing regressions on sites. So conclusions of the session is that many front-end components are still lacking processes for the continuous upgrade path, as we can see on this presentation. And the positive side, many of the APIs have already defined plans that are well-defined and can be worked on when there's urgency around deprecating usages of that API. We should continue with the idea of providing a new starter kit theme in favor of Classy. This would enable innovation and bug fixes on the default markup that we ship. And I do think we should start testing the idea of bundling CSS and markup together to reduce the chances of regressions. And potentially, if we can go far enough with this, we could even remove stable from Drupal Core eventually. So yeah, we have a minute for thoughts, feelings, questions about this plan. And I'm checking the chat if we have any questions. So it seems like Jess asked, would the front matter thingy be implemented in core teams too? I think we should implement the front matter thing in core teams too. That's what I would recommend, because that would set the pattern. And since I don't think everyone should use the starter kit, I think, and not everyone wants to use the starter kit, then we would have an alternative or additional layer of kind of safety around our backwards compatibility. And Jess is also recommending that the buff about starter kit would be a good idea. Yeah, I think so. I'm wondering if the buff schedule is still open, if we can still schedule a buff. If you can, you should definitely do that. Do we have any other questions about the plans or thoughts or feelings? So the next question is that would starter kit generate a new team dependent on stable 9? So yeah, right now I think we should probably make it generate a team dependent on stable 9. Maybe it should be even a setting on the as we generate the team. Maybe it should be up to the person who is generating a team. Maybe we can provide like some kind of options as part of the when people generate those teams. But if we can implement the plan on bundling CSS, JavaScript, and markup together, we might not even necessarily need stable anymore in core. And as a result, the starter kit could generate the team always without using a base team. Yeah, the finesse, that's the right location for the slides. I will post them right after we wrap up the talk. So I think we are 2 minutes over. If we don't have any more thoughts, feelings, or questions, I think we can wrap this up. Thank you for all of the participants. I hope you found something interesting out of this, and looking forward to collaborating with you on these problems.